Humans are strange creatures in so many ways that set us apart from other animals. Sure, we got our big brains and opposable thumbs and ability to write, but we're also the only mammal that willingly delays sleep.
What's an elephant do when it's tired? It just lays its big old butt down for a nap. Chimpanzees or baboons, they sleep almost 10 hours a day.
Truly respect the animal kingdom's commitment to self-care.
But us humans, we pull all-nighters to cram in studying. We guzzle energy drinks so we can stay up partying. We binge watch the latest Netflix show until 2 a.m.
And our troubled relationship with sleep also extends to the business environment. There are overnight shifts at the factory, late night emails to colleagues who work overseas, super long morning commutes, triggering notification sounds, and even triggering dreams featuring those triggering notification sounds.
And all that sleep deprivation, it's a serious red flag. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control says more than a third of American adults don't get enough sleep. The CDC has gone so far as to call it a public health problem. But our lack of sleep is also a big corporate red flag. That's because every year, worker fatigue costs the United States economy $411 billion due to lost productivity.
So the question is, what are we going to do about it?
This is Green Flags, the podcast that searches for a better business model, one that puts humanity at its core and is more profitable in the long run as a result.
Skeptical? Don't believe us? Well, keep listening.
We'll seek out the green flags that demonstrate a way of doing business that works for us, not the other way around. And we're going to push companies to adopt those practices. I'm Adam Fetcher. I have a history of helping companies define their values and deliver meaningful action against them. And I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Public Engagement for New Belgium Brewing Company.
And I'm Maude Standish, a futurist and innovation consultant and executive producer of Odd Media. In this episode, we'll hear why being sleep deprived can be as bad as being drunk. Then, we're going to find ways to grab the green flags for you and the green flags for business. You know, if they prefer their workforce to be capable of sitting upright and not falling asleep on the job.
This is all pretty metaphorical, but you know what we mean. We're talking about bold leadership, actions we can take to drive change, and how doing right by people is definitely the best path to business success.
But first, let's begin in Atlanta.
While I was pregnant, I think I daydreamed about the act of sleeping pretty much all the time. I was just always thinking about sleeping, even if I wasn't sleeping.
That's Kate Sweeney. These days, she's a freelance journalist and a book author. But back in her early 20s, Kate worked at a radio news station, and she was all in on the go, go, go mentality of our modern day work culture.
There were naturally days with really long hours. Sometimes I would be filling in as the morning host, or I would produce the morning shift. And when you're there for the morning shift, you have to get there at 5 a.m. And then after that shift is done, you stay. Your day is not done. You're working on stories. And in my earliest days, I'd be staying till maybe 6 that night, but I kind of had that magical youthful stamina going still.
I remember that feeling.
Yeah.
I know. I wish I could bottle up and drink that instead of Red Bull or coffee because it's not the same.
Right. And then during this time, work was the only thing I kind of had going, which sounds sad, but I was young, I had no kids, and I was really ambitious. So working long hours was just fine. And I loved my job so much and loved my work, and napping felt like it would be lazy.
Then Kate got pregnant.
And during this period at home, my husband took really unflattering photos of me asleep in front of the TV, at 8:30 at night. There's this series of me with drool. And it's just, they're horribly unflattering, and he thinks they're hilarious. So it's during this period that I started grabbing naps at work. And at a radio station, you have studios. And studios are the best place to nap. They're dark and they're quiet. So, I'd maybe just grab 15 minutes and I'd turn on the white noise app on my phone and I'd conk out. So then I had my baby. And at that point, like, oh my God, I was just constantly tired. And so I kept napping. And honestly, like, it made me a better employee. You know, it just made my work better. But I still didn't tell anyone. Like, they were my secret naps.
Why do you think you kept it a secret? What do you think was making you be like, ooh, I can't tell anyone's hack that is actually making me better at my job?
Because I didn't want them to judge me. Like, I didn't want them to think I was lazy, which is... I feel like that's so American. I just wanted to be seen as like, she's on it and she's working.
You know, I have an 18-month-old daughter at home, so this really speaks to me. It's frankly exhausting to be fully engaged at work while raising tiny humans.
As Kate just mentioned, it's part of the American culture to be always on. And the original concept of the 8-hour workday with 8 hours of leisure time and 8 hours of sleep, well, that model has been completely blown up.
There's a reason we're focusing on the need for sleep, as well as the problems associated with not having it. That's because in this season of Green Flags, we're going to explore how companies can help us climb the steps of a theoretical pyramid called Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
A little backstory for those who aren't familiar with the hierarchy of needs. It's a behavioral theory that basically says human motivation depends on 5 basic needs, from safety to esteem, all the way up to self-actualization. The hierarchy of needs was created in the 1940s by a psychologist named, you guessed it, Abraham Maslow, and it's still highly influential in business today.
Don't worry. The whole next episode of Green Flags will explain Maslow's theory. But what you need to know right now is that the very first step of the hierarchy of needs is defined as physiological needs.
Those are like the bare essentials for our self-preservation. Things like clothing, shelter, food, and yes, sleep.
So let's get cracking. Earlier, we hinted at some of the negative effects of sleep deprivation. But let's look at the surprising ways that it impacts our work and what it means for the financial performance of our employers.
And we found just the guy to help us out.
We are our best selves at work when we get the sleep that we need.
Christopher Barnes is a professor of organizational behavior at the University of Washington Business School in Seattle. And his specialty? Sleep and fatigue issues in the workplace.
My interest in sleep came from my time before I was an academic. I started off in the United States Air Force in the Air Force Research Laboratory, and they have a branch called the Fatigue Countermeasures Branch. So what happens in the Air Force is they have a lot of missions at times of day in which people should really be sleeping. So they have to study what happens when we send out pilots and other air crews on, say, a 60-hour mission to the other side of the planet and then back.
At the time, Chris Barnes was a lieutenant managing those research projects, which he found utterly fascinating. So he said to himself, I want to become an actual researcher.
But when he started his PhD in organizational behavior, well, Chris realized there was almost no academic research on what happens when people are sleep deprived and how it influences their work.
And so I set out to make that my mission.
So we asked this former military man who worked in the Fatigue Countermeasures Branch of the Air Force, what are the best tactics to fight workplace fatigue?
Some people treat Starbucks as if it were their Fatigue Countermeasures Branch, which is probably not the ideal strategy.
Look, no shade to your venti oat milk latte, but Chris says a much better and much cheaper strategy than Starbucks is something he calls good sleep hygiene.
And so that comes down to engaging in the right set of behaviors that are consistent with a good night of sleep and avoiding some of the other behaviors which are inconsistent with a good night of sleep. And probably the most important thing that you can do is to have a stable sleep schedule.
Chris is most sympathetic towards shift workers. They're at an obvious disadvantage because their constantly changing schedules make it really tough to develop healthy sleep routines.
But for most of us that are not engaged in shift work, we still make poor choices as far as an unstable bedtime.
He points to a body of research focused on what's known as social jet lag.
Let's say someone works a Monday through Friday schedule and they have the weekends off. Friday night comes around and they say, all right, Saturday morning, I don't have to get up early for work, so I can stay up late and do fun things. But it usually ends up pushing their bedtime back later that night and pushing their wake time back later that morning. So it's almost like they've crossed a time zone, maybe even 2 time zones. And then Saturday night comes around and maybe they do the same thing, maybe even to a greater degree. And so then Sunday night comes around and they say, uh-oh, I need to get up early again on Monday for work.
And all those party girls and boys who shifted their schedules into the wee hours, they have to undo those time changes all at once on Sunday night.
There's some physiological reasons why that doesn't work very well. And so usually what happens is on that Monday, we go to work with less sleep than we otherwise would. And we blame it on Monday. And we look at cartoons of Garfield complaining about Mondays. But really, it's because we have voluntarily induced jet lag in ourselves.
Okay, so if you are someone who's got a case of the Mondays, is it smart to drink coffee? Sure, as long as you don't have any on Monday afternoon.
Caffeine has a half-life of 5 or 6 hours, meaning that after you drink caffeine, 5 or 6 hours later, about half of that caffeine will still be circulating in your body, influencing your ability to fall asleep. So you want a few of those half-lives to elapse. So 10, 12 hours of no caffeine is great before bedtime.
That is such good advice. I need to stop drinking my last cup of coffee at like 5 p.m. every day.
And sorry to break it to some of you, but there are other substances that should also be avoided at night.
Nicotine is a stimulant that makes it harder to fall asleep, so avoid nicotine within a few hours of bedtime. Alcohol is an interesting one because some people have an experience where they drink a whole lot of alcohol and find it very easy to fall asleep. And then they probably don't wake up the next day and stretch and yawn and say, "Ooh, what a great night of sleep that was." So you also want to avoid alcohol within a few hours of bedtime as well.
Chris says, like most things, it's about moderation, which means, 1 can of Voodoo Ranger close to bedtime won't really affect your sleep.
So let's say you're not following this advice, like me maybe, or you have a chronic sleep disorder, or you're just a total workaholic. How is this tied to your work performance?
The quality of the work is going to suffer. We find that people are more unethical when they're sleep deprived, that people's leadership suffers when they're sleep deprived. We know from several research studies that people are also less creative when they're sleep deprived.
Chris says instead of thinking about how many hours you've worked, a better way to measure your value for employers is to consider the quality of your work.
What's the creativity of my work? How effectively am I leading other people? So what's the sum total value across these multiple criteria? I think we will often find that protecting our sleep time will lead to more total value to the organization as well, because we are better employees.
As in employees who do the right thing at work and don't, cheat or steal. As Chris mentioned, his research shows that sleep deprivation can actually lead to unethical behavior.
This is due to the fact that employees have many opportunities to behave unethically, and they must resist those temptations to behave unethically. But when we are sleep deprived, our ability to exert self-control is undermined. And so we find that the same individual is more or less likely to behave unethically on different days, based in part on how much and how well they slept the night before.
He also says that there's an increased risk of workplace injuries. After all, we know that 1 in 5 auto accidents are a result of drowsy driving. And then there are major disasters, like the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion and the Exxon Valdez oil tanker spill. They were caused in large part by workers who were severely sleep deprived. I'm not saying napping saves lives, but napping absolutely saves lives.
It's worth noting, accidents like these cost businesses billions of dollars in fines and fees and court battles, not to mention years of bad press and reputational damage.
Companies should be aware that when workers lose out on sleep, we lose our ability to process information clearly. Remember when I told you a lack of sleep can be a lot like being drunk? Chris explains why.
One of my favorite studies, not my own research, but out in the published literature, they had participants sleep in the research laboratory for 5 hours each night for 4 nights in a row. So over the course of these 4 nights, they had participants engage in a relatively simple cognitive task. And they measured the decrement in performance as their performance went down across these successive nights due to the accumulation of sleep deprivation.
After the participants in the research got a couple of weeks to rest up, they came back. But this time, they were tested on how much alcohol it took to degrade their cognitive performance. So how did sleeplessness compare to being drunk?
They found that it was equivalent to a blood alcohol content of 0.06.
Keep in mind, the DUI limit in nearly every state is 0.08.
So if you have slept 5 hours for 4 nights in a row, you are almost as impaired as someone who is too legally drunk to drive.
I guess that means if you're sleep deprived, you're effectively buzzed when making business decisions. So how does this impact business as a whole?
The sleep of one employee can influence the work outcomes of a different employee.
Chris says you'll often see this play out through what he calls abusive supervision.
Abusive supervision is, just think about prototypical jerky boss behavior, maybe yelling at subordinates, scolding them in front of their colleagues. And we found that when a given leader has a bad night of sleep, the next day that leader goes to work with impaired self-control and is more likely to lash out towards subordinates with that abusive supervision. So the leader thinks everything is fine, but the subordinate does not think everything is fine.
And what if it's the employees who are sleep deprived? Then it's a lot harder to inspire them.
They express more hostility towards leaders, and then the leaders perceive the relationship to be of poor quality. What I think is interesting about that one is neither party seems to be aware of the effect of their own sleep deprivation on the perceptions of the quality of the relationship as seen by the other party.
And that's what we'll focus on next: perceptions and the quality of coworker relationships. As mentioned, Adam works for New Belgium Brewing, and he recently had a chance to meet up in Fort Collins, Colorado, with his colleague, Courtney Simmons. Courtney's the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at New Belgium. And let me set this up by saying there's a whole lot more to consider when it comes to the implications of sleep deprivation and diversity. I'll let Adam take it from here.
Courtney, thank you so much for being on the podcast. So we're sitting here on the home campus, the original brewery of New Belgium Brewing. And so let's talk a little bit about rest and sleep in a business context. What are the things that come up for you?
Is it okay to say that I could really use a nap right now?
I'm guessing that's probably what comes to most people's minds first and foremost.
Be appropriate, right? That like so many of us, I think, are over engaged and over involved and plates over full, and rest. Honestly, in a business context, it almost feels a little bit laughable to think about the idea of managing and prioritizing rest. But what gets in the way of rest is this grind culture in pursuit of high performance that we've created in the U.S. in our businesses.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think we have created a grind culture. And the question is, what would you say is the responsibility of the company in today's day and age to at least try to push back against the grind culture that you described?
It's really easy, I think, for organizations to acknowledge that coworkers are struggling with burnout and that they're struggling with exhaustion. It's much harder, I think, for organizations to make the tangible practice and policy and program changes that really make it different and better for our coworkers if we claim to be concerned about the humans in our business.
And at the end of the day, I mean, that leadership really needs to come from the very top, right? So is that a message of, hey, we don't need to grow those couple extra points this year, and as a result, we can take our foot off the gas when it comes to working late nights or working early mornings or working on the weekend?
I think so. I mean, it's so hard, Adam, because stretch goals are a really important part of business, and I think they help us understand what we're seeking to try to achieve. I think that has to be balanced with creating a culture around taking breaks, right? What we know about brains is that we do better production. Our brains close loops in problems when we're resting. And so if we can create a culture of breaking and taking time, the most extreme examples of that are organizations that mandate that, like, you can't have meetings on a Friday or you can't send emails after a certain time. And that's super hard in a 24-hour business.
So what would you say about how this notion of sleep and rest is impacted by marginalization and the lived experience of, people who are outside majority culture?
Yeah. So I think outside of just corporate experiences, what comes to mind for me, and I do a super terrible job of describing this, but I remember being on social media at one point in the recent history, and it was like, name things that it's okay for like affluent white people to do that would be considered problematic if it was like a person of color, right? And then the idea of like leaving work early on a Friday. For a white person, it's self-care. For a person of color, it might be considered lazy, right? And like you throw on all the stereotypes and expectations that have come from this like history of just racism and other isms. And the reality is that a lot of people feel, and the research indicates that people from underrepresented groups either have to or feel like they have to work harder than their counterparts.
So what do organizations do about this?
Generally speaking, I think the organization should have a policy for everyone to get the rest that they need. Because again, if we're solving for the most marginalized in our business, generally speaking, a rising tide raises all boats. But then they should understand if team members are being disproportionately impacted by the policies as they exist. Is there a way that we can do this that resonates with our entire business and creates a better culture around rest? And so some of the things I think that organizations can evaluate is the way that they evaluate their coworkers and where bias might be coming into play there, and specifically addressing terms that might be rooted in stereotypic thinking. And if someone's being described as lazy, is it possible that they're exhausted?
That's great. I'm wondering if you can speak to kind of an individual manager perspective for a moment. So I'll use myself as an example. I always feel a range of conflicting emotions when I'm either asking my team to take on urgent priorities or sometimes things that just we didn't get to during the week, during after hours or on the weekends. And I try to avoid that when I can, but sometimes it's necessary. I try to handle that by saying, well, do it when you can, when you have a break, or, don't let this get in the way of the importance of family time. But it's usually a little ham-handed. At the end of the day, if the coworker's motivated and the work needs to get done, it needs to get done. And it's going to eat into some measure of rest or leisure time. So I'm curious, what advice would you give to managers who are in that situation?
A few things that come to mind. I think co-creating solutions is a really great place to start. If I am wanting to make a good impression and I'm exhausted as hell and my boss says do it whenever, I'm still going to cram it in there because I want to make a good impression. What's been super helpful to me in the past is leaders that are like, okay, so I need to drop in this priority that came up unexpectedly, and I know you have all of these other things on your plate. Like, how do we determine which of these things can be deprioritized or maybe even eliminated, right? You've been cranking on items X, Y, Z, and now you have to put in items A and B. What can go away from X, Y, Z, or how do we push that out? I think it's also really nice to say, okay, if we identify that the solution is that you have to work on Saturday, then how do we carve back some of that time? So like typically you work Monday through Friday. I need this on Saturday, so maybe you don't work Monday.
Yeah, well, one of the other emotions that comes up for me when that happens is like, heck yeah, they're doing work on off hours. I got a motivated team. They're ambitious. They're just paying their dues. And I realize that's a pretty toxic attitude, but I would be lying if I didn't say that was part of what I have a tendency to expect from my teams. But, I think what you're bringing to the table is a reminder that some people who have marginalized experiences face even a greater need to show that they're always on, that they're never taking a break.
What's so interesting in this conversation, though, is that there is a really important role, I think, as a leader to create a culture of feedback and candor so that you can have conversations. Because the other thing that, like if we created a policy here that said you can't work in your off hours ever, one challenge therein is that I do currently in my workday, and not all coworkers have this, but I do have the ability to flex. And so if I need to be present for like a kid or family thing during my workday, it's really important to me to be able to make up some time in the evening. And if that is taken away, that would be that would be more problematic for me than like my current experience around rest. And so I think that there is this deep need for us as leaders to build competency, to hear from and listen to our coworkers, to do that especially across cultural differences, so that we can create an environment where I can say, here's a thing, I'm thinking, here's what I think we need to do. And my team member can say, that doesn't work for me, and here's why. And when they challenge me, my ego isn't threatened, and I don't over prioritize my intent. And I say, oh, wow, thanks for helping me understand how that would impact you. Let's come up with a better third solution. And I just don't think we do that enough in general in business. I think that passion for a third solution and collecting more insight from more people before we converge on a solution, I think we would benefit from that. And that's, at its core, that's diversity and inclusion work.
Thank you, Courtney. Appreciate the time you spent with us.
That's my deepest pleasure. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks so much for sharing that conversation, Adam. It's these things that we should be thinking about, but we just aren't always present in our mind when we're kind of thinking about the role of business in our lives, especially if we're only seeing it from our point of view.
Totally. It's human nature to project your own experience on other people, but business leaders have a higher responsibility to really be aware of the fact that, as Courtney said, different people of different lived experiences have different conceptions of sleep and rest, as well as, frankly, different motivations when it comes to what is required to feel like they're successful or be successful. It's not an even playing field. So it's been fascinating to understand how a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens can be put on this kind of basic human idea of sleep.
It actually reminds me of this sort of dumb story that shows how like an idiot white girl I can be, which is, you're thinking that everyone's operating on the same playing field because it's all about your output. So when I was listening to you and Courtney talk, it reminded me of this moment that I had a few years back where I was talking to a Black friend who I used to work with. And she was kind of giving me shit because I always kind of dressed like a homeless teenager to work. And, it was something that I always kind of thought as being cool because it was differentiating, but it was also me saying, like, I don't really care about how I look. I care about the work that I make. But we were having a drink together and she was like, I would love to wear overalls and a hoodie to work. But as a Black woman, if I do that, people think of me as slovenly and they don't accept the work that I put in front of them. And it just sort of, while you were talking to Courtney, I had a flashback to that moment and was thinking of all the times that I haven't maybe accepted somebody of a different background's sleep schedule just because of my own ingrained biases and perceptions.
It's so true. On a personal level, for me as a white man, it just takes a lot of awareness about my own privilege and a lot of training. Frankly, I need more in order to be able to see my own bias. And as a business leader, that just becomes even more important. From a kind of corporate perspective, I've worked with so many businesses that either don't want to engage on the issues of racial justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion because they feel like it's outside their wheelhouse. They've got another focus around the environment or other social issues, and they treat racial justice and DEI like a separate issue entirely, when in fact, it's endemic to absolutely every part of our society and absolutely every part of the corporate environment.
That's honestly why I think these conversations are so important to be had, even though they're hard to do. And when it comes to things like sleep and rest and productivity, if we're designing a system that is only reflective of a portion of our workforce, then we're truly not designing a system that works well for the people. And as we know, that means that it'll likely be less successful in the long run as well.
And finally, after listening back to my interview with Courtney, I have to admit, I asked a question of her in which I really fell into the trap of assuming that always being on does lead to higher productivity and growth. But what she said really stuck with me. It can feel counterintuitive to say sleep more and revenue will follow. But as we've heard today, that's the honest truth.
As someone who craves the rest that chimps and baboons seem to just naturally get every night, I feel it. Just because we have the ability to do more in a day doesn't mean we should. It comes back to the quality over quantity of hours worked.
Okay, let's get into why our bodies and our minds act the way they do. Chris Barnes says, when it comes to sleep, we have an inherited physiology that puts us in one of two camps.
There are night owls, like me, who do some of our best work in the evening and don't like to get up at the crack of dawn. In fact, we don't usually perform well at work during those early hours at all.
You are fighting the tide on this. You're fighting against your own body, your own physiology. You're pushing that rock uphill. And so we sometimes make employees do this when it's not necessarily something that needs to be done.
And then there are people known as larks who obnoxiously wake up at the crack of dawn.
Is it bad that I'm slowly raising my hand right now as a lark?
Sorry, Adam.
No worries. But I think I might know why, as a night owl, you're so annoyed. That's because far too many employers don't take these varying sleep patterns into account. Here's Chris to explain.
You can force a lark to work late at night, and you can force an owl to work early in the morning, but you're going to undermine the amount and the quality of the sleep that they get. You're going to undermine the alertness that they bring while they're waking and working.
And Chris definitely sees this playing out in the workplace, like all the time.
When I was in the Air Force, this was very much a very strong stereotype there. People in the military often brag about how we get more done before 6 a.m. than most people do all day long. I can remember a time back when I still held this stereotype that if you start your day late, that you must be lazy. And it wasn't until I encountered the research literature that said, no, there's a physiological basis behind chronotype that I was like, oh, man, I've been misjudging some people.
Chris says that's what usually happens when people use flex time to start their day early.
Their supervisors judge them as more conscientious and as higher performers.
We night owls might be doing the exact same amount of work as larks. But just because we function better later in the day, we're seen by our bosses as, well, lazier.
So what I'm telling you is that flex time is a great tool for helping to align work schedules with circadian rhythms. And I'm also telling you that we're screwing it up.
Chris says if corporate leaders were willing to stamp out this stereotype,
then we can better utilize flex time as a way to get better health outcomes and better work outcomes out of employees.
You know, Adam, we're doing this episode on sleep because it's one of the most basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the lack of sleep and rest for American workers is actually getting a lot of attention right now.
I think we're all collectively waking up to the importance of sleep.
That's Rebecca Robbins, an instructor at Harvard Medical School and a scientist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston.
And one of the barometers of this is just the enormous interest and explosion of sleep tracking products and sleep-related products. So nutraceuticals that address sleep and gadgets and eye masks and pajamas.
But this societal shift shouldn't just focus on individual habits. While a lack of sleep and rest among workers is getting noticed, we spend a lot less time discussing the changes that companies can make and the gains to their bottom line if they do right by their people. Fortunately, Rebecca says there's actually a growing number of green flags in business practices happening now.
The good news is there are a couple work sites out there that are really taking a leadership role on employee health and well-being and sleep specifically. The Huffington Post, for instance, was one of the first to put nap pods in their work site. Google is another. Whenever I've been to their buildings, they have these beautiful nap pods.
In fact, lots of companies like Procter & Gamble, Samsung, and Nike have sleeping pods in their office spaces. Other green flags? The FAA recently mandated that flight attendants get 10 hours of rest between flights, which is an extra 2 hours from what they had before. Rebecca also points out a Goldman Sachs policy that tells employees not to send any emails on Saturday mornings.
Yeah, and there are now laws in countries like France and Portugal that prohibit your boss from emailing you over the weekend. Rebecca says these institutional policies really go a long way.
Because that signals to an employee that, okay, my employer wants me to take a break, wants me to get outside, get off email, and get out and do something that would be good for my health, my sleep health, and well-being.
It bears repeating, the economic hit on U.S. businesses due to sleeping issues is $411 billion. That's more than the entire GDP of countries like Ireland, Israel, or the Philippines.
And it's significant in terms of the consequences of sleep deprivation, including reduced productivity. And then also more concerningly are the accidents and injuries that can happen when we're sleeping insufficiently or maybe have an untreated sleep disorder.
We mentioned earlier that shift workers might have the hardest time getting a sufficient amount of sleep. But there is some hope for them if companies are willing to shake things up. Back in 2015, for example, there was a really interesting test case at a factory to solve this very issue. Researchers worked with a big steel manufacturer, ThyssenKrupp, to figure out which employees were larks and which were night owls. Then, the company assigned the early risers to the day shift and had the night owls work the late shift. And guess what happened?
They made incredibly super shiny steel?
Well, maybe, hopefully. But the green flag here is that these workers, they started getting an extra hour of sleep every night.
Whoa, that's actually approaching my new aspirational baboon level of sleep.
And Rebecca herself discovered another way to get us even closer to baboon level.
Tell me more.
Well, she conducted her own real-world clinical trial around worker sleep, and it also found very promising results.
This is a huge employer, and we found really remarkable findings in terms of employee sleep, their mental health, and their healthcare utilization.
She couldn't tell us the name of the company in order to protect patient security. But she can tell us that her team of researchers partnered with a large healthcare provider based in the Northeast United States.
We did a clinical trial where we evaluated a really comprehensive sleep health program for employees. We had a kickoff educational session where we talked all about sleep and circadian rhythms, and then provided employees with ongoing access to a digital health coach.
As in a health app for employees to use on their phones.
This clinical trial was carried out for 9 months during the pandemic. Remember, this was a time when mental health concerns were at an all-time high, and the results were surprising and encouraging.
After this program, we found those who received the intervention were sleeping better. They were reporting better mental health outcomes. And what was so interesting, they also demonstrated less healthcare utilization, specifically less mental health utilization.
Meanwhile, Rebecca says there's a lot of room for companies to embrace sleep programs.
We analyzed some data from work sites across the U.S., and we found that fewer than 10% of work sites offered any sort of workplace health programming relating to sleep.
That's crazy, especially since we know that Harvard Medical School estimates insomnia alone may be the cause of 274,000 occupational safety incidents every year, which costs businesses $31 billion.
Okay, so let's run through what we've learned today. We know a culture of rest actually leads to more productivity, not less.
We know when coworkers get good sleep and have downtime, they're happier, more loyal, more collaborative, more creative, and ultimately they drive better business results over the long term.
We also know a culture of inadequate rest leads to risky decisions, almost like we're drunk. Some days I feel like I'm drunk when I'm tired, but not today. Today, let's discuss what are the green flags businesses need to go after when it comes to sleep.
Well, let's start with the idea that every company, for its own interest, should drop the mistaken idea that working people 24 hours a day leads to more productivity. Let's dispel that myth right here and right now.
Amen.
Like the Air Force, every business should operate its own version of a fatigue countermeasures group and adopt real policies and practices to ensure adequate rest and sleep among coworkers.
Another green flag? Businesses should think creatively about concrete ways to ensure workers have downtime. They can consider things like encouraging breaks from screens and messages, blocking email access on Saturday morning, building sleeping pods, or if you're like me, just stuffing an old mattress under your desk.
And businesses won't be doing right by their people or their own bottom lines unless, like Courtney told us, they're putting a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens on fatigue countermeasures. We all need to recognize that simply stepping away from your email or letting a task slip that extra day or two is much, much harder for marginalized communities than it is for white people in the majority.
The same goes for shift workers, who have less flexibility to care for themselves, and therefore need these measures built into company policy in order for the business and its employees to reap the benefits.
Finally, if your company still thinks that grind culture is the best way to motivate people and grow the business, share this podcast or use this information you heard today to advocate internally for a shift in thinking. And if your company still won't shift, well, I guess you should consider finding a company to work for that has already adopted some of these green flags.
And our next episode will take you on a journey through Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs and why we base this series around this well-known theory.
And now's a great time to subscribe to Green Flags on your favorite podcast app, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening to us right now. I'm Adam Fetcher.
And I'm Maude Standish. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Christy Weaver, and I've been a coworker at Belgium Brewing since 2014. I serve as the data management lead in For Cons, Colorado. And I'm here to give credit where credit is due. Green Flags is a co-production of Odd Media and New Belgium Brewing. This episode was written and produced by John Haas and Maude Standish with help from Adam Fetcher. Post-production for Green Flags is provided by Talented Friends, Inc., with original music and sound design by Jason Reimer. Our executive producers are Maude Standish, Russell Sansgiri, Adam Fetcher, and John Belangi. Our communications guru is Megan Olson. Creative support from Zoe Evanitis and Kelsey Ireland. Special thanks to those who lent their voices to this episode, including Kate Sweeney, Chris Barnes, Courtney Simmons, and Rebecca Robbins. Thanks also to Dana Kelly, Abby Zarnecki, Laura Smith, Celine Wright, and Steve Fetchheimer, and all the coworkers at New Belgium Brewing. You can find Green Flags on Spotify, Apple Music, Stitcher, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.